Hare Krishna, welcome to my channel. In this episode, I am going to discuss a very serious subject matter which has been harming our Vaidic Sanatan Civilization for a long time. So my humble request, please listen this episode very carefully. Overrunning Asia in the wake of its nascent imperialism in the 18th century, Western scholarship ran berserk, propounding half-baked theories and forcing mistaken theses on the subjugated people of the world. One such mistaken notion forced on a psychologically supine world was the phantom of a so-called Aryan race theory. Ever since, armies of scholars have for generations all the world over been hard put to define what an Aryan signifies, identify his language, and locate its homeland. This funny shadow chasing was bound to result in nothing but utter confusion and total failure, because blundering Western scholarship has raised the phantom of the so-called Aryan race out of his own imagination, caused by a basic misunderstanding of the ancient term Arya. Evidence is now available that the Aryans were no race at all. Therefore, their supposed migration in waves and spread over Asia and Europe appears to be a big joke in perspective. Sanskrit-speaking Bharatiyas had coined the word Arya to signify an ideal or unqualification. To the Bharatiyas, Arya signified a thoroughbred, a perfect gentleman, an ideal person, a superman. Spiritually speaking, a person who strictly follows Varnashrama system is called an Aryan. So it's a qualification. Being great idealists and sticklers for purity of behavior and morality, the Aryans constantly referred to the Arya concept as a state of evolution to which every individual must aspire. What better proof of this truth can be found than the well-known maxim Krunvanto Vishwam Aryam, meaning make the entire world Aryan. Had the word Aryan signified a race, the above dictum would not have come into being, because race-conscious people, far from wanting to assimilate the world in their fold, believe in maintaining an exclusive identity. You can better understand what happening today in the Islamic world, and Islam and Israel and Gaza party, what is happening between them. So the word Aryan signified an ideal man and no race, is again proved by Lord Krishna admonishing to Arjuna, "Be not a coward," in Bhagavad Gita, said un-Aryan feelings and be ready to stand up and fight. Lord Krishna, being a divine incarnation, divine personality, he would never identify himself with only one race to the discriminating exclusion of others. Another proof is afforded by the vocative use of the term Arya in ancient Bharat to accost the husband or the king. The other vocative synonym for a husband was Bara. In Sanskrit, the term Bara signifies a highly accomplished person. Hence, the term Arya too had an identical connotation. Therefore, to regard Aryans as some race which distinguished itself from others and ruthlessly dominated the so-called Dasyus or slaves or the native indigenous people is a blunder, complete blunder, which has vitiated the study of all ancient Bharatiya and world history. Dasyus means which is mentioned in Vedas, we will discuss it later. The term Arya was nothing more than a general honorific as a modern speaker addresses his audience as ladies and gentlemen. That does not mean that the speaker himself does not count itself among gentlemen, or that those not present among the audience are not gentlemen. In this case, just as ladies and gentlemen do not constitute any special race, similarly, when the ancient Bharatiyas uttered the word Arya, they did not refer to any race or distinguish Aryan as masters from some others supposed to be slaves. Some Russian authors, for example, Mr. Dunn and Dostoevsky, have in their book titled Heredity, Race and Society expressed a similar opinion when they observed, they are saying in their book, Max Muller on a unlucky day used the word Aryan race. Thus, there arose truly out of talk alone, an imaginative creature, Aryan man. This Max Muller is also a fool, but strangely he is praised by Swami Vivekananda. आप अगर पढ़े हैं विवेकानंद की किताब तो आपको पता होगा विवेकानंद ये मैक्स मुलर की बहुत तारीफ किए हैं. बट विवेकानंद वाज ए फूल एंड दिस मैक्स मुलर वाज ए बिगर फूल. वी विल डिस्कस इट लेटर. Professor T. Muro, in his book titled The Sanskrit Language, observed that for the Indo-Aryan invention of India, no direct evidence is available. In the text of Rig Veda itself, although historical allusions are not uncommon, there is no reference anywhere to the fact of the migration nor any definite record, and this evidence is enough to refute the notion long held that Indians are a conglomerate of Central Asia and Arctic people. Indian history books start by making us learn by the root at the very outset that we are aliens, we Indians are aliens, and that the real inhabitants of India were the aboriginals. We, the aliens, invaded India and almost exterminated its original inhabitants. We are asked to believe it. Those of them who survived the Holocaust got absorbed in the Aryan fold. It is necessary to take a second, closer look at this sinister doctrine. One way of looking at the classifying human beings has been based on their complexion. Thus, it is said that there are 4 major groups of people in our world. Number 1, whites. Number 2, blacks. Number 3, browns. And number 4, yellows. This may be alright so far as it goes. But to identify the whites as Aryans is a historical blunder. As explained earlier, Aryan was a synonym for a gentleman, a thoroughbred. Therefore, any or all of the 4 groups of people could be called Aryans. This is exactly what happens. The Germans and Greeks, who are whites, and the Bharatiyas, who are classed among the browns, are all supposed to be Aryans. If Aryans were a race, this could not happen. But since those people have a common Sanskrit culture, they have been commonly using the honorific word Arya to refer to each other. Such repeated use of the word Arya subsequently made blundering Western scholarship, spearheaded by Max Muller, to misinterpret it as a race. It is then argued that since languages with Sanskritic affinities are known to exist over a very vast region, from Bali to Baltic and from Korea to Kaba, they must have a common linguistic ancestors. It is facilely assumed that ancestral language was something akin to Sanskrit, but not Sanskrit. Then it is also argued that the language closest to the so-called Indo-European is Lithuanian. Hence, those who spoke the original Indo-European language migrated from near the Baltic. The entire theory of Aryan migration is based on this slender stem. Then follow detailed description of the original home of the Aryan and routes A and B, followed by their 2 massive migrations. Reading such descriptions, one wonders as to who was the lucky chronicler who sat detached perched on a high rock or hopped all the way observing and charting the route followed by waves of migrating Aryans. Historians, who are generally known to ask all sorts of hedging questions before accepting any theory, seem to have gulped the Aryan race and their migration theories without much of questioning or thinking. Some linguists seem to lay down the dictum that the original home of Aryans must be deemed to be region where the majority of Indo-European languages are spoken. So the inevitable conclusion from this would be that the so-called Aryans migrated from Europe. But philologists are not agreed even on this. They mention the Pamir Plateau or Turkey or Iceland to be the original homes of the Aryans. You see the funny conspiracy theory. Their very basic argument is that Europe ought to be the original home of the Aryans because a majority of Indo-European languages are found to exist there. Could in fact lead to a very different conclusion. Let us take very interesting example. In America, USA, present USA, in our own times, we find a concentration of the most varied dialects, not only of Europe and England in particular, but of many other regions. What does it signify? It does not prove that Americans colonized Europe, but vice versa. This is very important point. By the same token, we can say that if European languages show a Sanskritic base and if Sanskrit flourishes in its pristine glory only in India, the conclusion is obvious that it was enterprising Bharatiyas who migrated to all other continents. Later on, when in the course of centuries links with Bharat snapped, the European languages retained only traces of Sanskrit, while the real Sanskrit still flourishes at its source, namely Bharat or present modern India. This conclusion is further reinforced by the fact that the ancient Vaidic Bharatiyas did have a dynamic slogan, Kurvanto Vishwam Aryan, make the whole world Aryan, which impelled them to push their conquest and explorations to the remotest lands to spread their knowledge and culture. With their preconceived theory of the Aryans being a race and Aryan migration to Bharat, European scholars tend to interpret all Vedic terms on the basis of a supposed conflict between the invading Aryan and the native Indians. Thus, the Vedic terms Ayajavanaha means non-sacrificers, or Shishnadevaha, phallus worshippers, and Pishnanga Vrishti, black people, are conceived by European scholars to be derogatory terms used by the invading Aryan for the native black Indians. It is quite reasonable to suspect that the Europeans superimposed their color prejudice on a bygone age and on an imaginary race of Aryans. Secondly, Shiva, Lord Shiva, being a deity mentioned in the Vedas, the term Sishna Devaha, meaning phallus worshippers, could not have been derogatory at all. It could be that some people worshipped Shiva while others did not. In that sense, it could be a purely distinctive trait. Moreover, Shishna Devaha could as well mean passionate or dynamic and not phallus worshippers at all. Therefore, to imagine that the term signifies the Dravidians as distinguished from Aryans is illogical and unphilosophical or philological. The word Pishnanga Trishti connotes a reddish brown tinge and not black color. हमारे वैष्णव आचार्यों का कहना है, in Vedas, even a single word, for example, Hari, has so many meanings. For example, Hari means lion, Hari means mouse, Hari means cat, Hari means monkey, Hari means also the Supreme Lord Vishnu. So एक शब्द का कई अर्थ होता है. ये जो वेस्टर्न स्कॉलर्स हैं, ये उनकी दिमाग में नहीं आएगा। वो अपना जो रेस प्रेजुडाइस है ना, वो इंडिया के ऊपर थोप रहे हैं। मैक्स मुलर्स initial blunder of dubbing the Rig Veda to be only 1200 years old has led to another blunder, namely of believing that the Mohenjo-daro people who lived 5000 years ago must be pre-Vedic. But the find of a Shiva plaque in the Indus Valley writings have exploded two fond beliefs of Western scholars. It can no longer be asserted that Mohenjo-daro was a Dravidian pre-Vedic civilization. Simultaneously, it has also been proved that the belief that the Rig Veda is only 1200 years old is untenable. As for the belief that the Vedas contain traces of any color struggle, it must be noted that among the so-called Aryans themselves, some were black and some fair. In fact, the word Varna does not always signify color. It signifies a class or division. For example, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra. Sage Karnya Rushi, had a dark complexion, and so had Vyasadeva. So far from the Vedas containing any description of wars between different colored people, we find the so-called Dasas or Aryan kings, both bracketed together as enemies by the third party. Thus we have Hanuman's mantra which say, "O Manu, with your help may we conquer both the Aryans and the Dasas." These are Vedic mantras. Number 2, "O Indra, with your help may we kill both the Dasas and Aryans." Rig Veda 10.83. Should this be interpreted to mean that before the real white Aryans invaded Bharat, some native Aryan variety already existed in Bharat? This is a very important question. Reference to Arctic geography, which Lokmanya Tilak discovers in the Vedas, could only mean that composers of Vedic hymns had penetrated as far as North Pole in their exploratory zeal, inspired by the ideal of carrying education, science and culture to the four corners of the world. This has been discussed by Dr. Avinash Chandra Das in his book titled Rig Vedic India. A distinct or diligent study of the Rig Veda will reveal that the Dasyus, the so-called Dasyus, were no rival race, differing in physiological characteristic from the so-called Aryans. The word Dasyu occurs about 40 times in the Rig Veda. At no place does it signify a race of the aboriginals as distinguished from the Aryans, believed to be whites. People think Aryans were white, particularly the Western scholars. The epithet Anus, as applied to the Dasyus, is interpreted by some Western scholars as implying those having no nose or flat-nosed, like the Chinese people. Sayana, a very Bharatiya scholar, interprets it as mouthless, which is plausible, considering that the Dasyus are known as of impaired speech, perhaps due to some curse. Since as means to sit, the term anus would signify the wanderer, the traveler. For example, gypsies. The Rig Veda 1.13.8 refers to the killing of the Dasyus for the sake of the humans. That means that the Dasyus were supernatural beings, some supernatural evil forces. Indra's slaying of the Dasyus is considered superhuman precisely because the Dasyus were superhumans. Scholars like Keith and MacDonnell in their book The Vedic Index also admit that Dasyus in many passages in the Rig Veda is clearly applied to superhuman enemies. Indra is a demigod, the rain giver, one used to release light and the waters, to dispel drought and darkness. He must purge of clouds and of snow which blocked those waters. To read in this a fancied allusion, as Western scholars do, to the destruction of the so-called non-Aryan civilization of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa by the Aryan Indra is to read theology and metaphysics as history. This is simply stupidity of or ignorance. आप समझ रहे हैं? थियोलॉजी इज डिफरेंट, मेटाफिजिक्स स्पिरिचुअल साइंस इज डिफरेंट. बट वेस्टर्न स्कॉलर्स, उनकी जो दिमाग है, जो द फॉलोअर्स ऑफ डार्विन थ्योरी, ये उनकी समझ में नहीं आएगा, जो गड़बड़ी यहीं करते हैं. Merely because the Dasyus are described as those not performing rituals, sacrifices or worship does not signify any enmity between them and the so-called Aryans. In our own times, the Jains and Buddhists could be described as those not following the Hindus' form of worship. That by itself does not connote enmity or hostility between the two parties. The Rig Veda prays 6.22 and 10, O Indra, give us that glory by which Dasyus will become Aryas, and all the humans' foes will be destroyed. All the human foes will be destroyed. This makes it quite clear that the term Arya meant an ideal human being, and not that there was no racial conflict between the Dasyus and Aryans. The Bharatiyas simply wanted the troublesome supernatural forces to be tamed. If the Dasyus could be tamed and civilized to become Aryans, it means that the two were not different in race. When the Rig Veda refers, it is written in 2.20.8. When the Rig Veda refers to O Indra, the slayer of Brutasura or Bruta, destroying the Krishna Yoni Dasyus, it is held aloft by Western scholars as proof that the invading Aryans destroyed the dark aboriginals. But they don't seem to have taken note that the Rig Veda also describes the Aryans as dark complexion. Thus the Rig Veda asserts Kanua Rishi, the son of Nisad, was black. 10.1.11 mantra number. Most of the hymens in the 8th mandala of the Rig Veda are composed the descendants of Kanua Rishi. One Kanua was the tutor of a branch of white Yajur Vedas. This shows that Kanua, though dark in complexion, was not a Dasyu. No feeling of inferiority is involved in admitting Kanua to be dark complexion. One Rig Vedic hymens 8.85.3 says, O Asujanis, this Krishna is making offering to you. Since Krishna signifies a person of dark complexion, it would mean that the composer of that hymen was dark. Just a Krishna Yoni Dasyu is taken to signify that the Dasyus were all black complexioned. आप ये ध्यान दीजिए, कृष्ण का मतलब द सुप्रीम पर्सनैलिटी ऑफ गॉड है. लॉर्ड कृष्ण भी हो सकता है, कृष्ण भी ब्लैक हैं, काले हैं. तो वेद में एक शब्द का अलग अलग अर्थ है, ये समझना पड़ेगा. जो परंपरा सिस्टम ऑथराइज्ड बोनाफाइड स्पिरिचुअल मास्टर की शरण में नहीं है, वो कभी वेद नहीं समझ सकता. ये हमारी वैष्णव आचार्य जो हैं हमको बार बार ये बोल के गए हैं. हाइमन, वैदिक हाइमन 2.3.9 of the Rig Veda prays, let our offspring be Twani. Twani means Pisang, in Hindi में कहते हैं Pisang. Since Twani is not white, the prayer proves that no stigma attached to a non-white complexion, and therefore there was no quarrel with the so-called Dasyus on the basis of color. Again in Hyman number 7.33.1, the Vasisthas are specifically described as white, which proves that the Bharatiyas of Vedic times were a mixed people, even as they are today, having all shades of complexions from the milk white to black. Therefore, to imagine the Aryan to be a race, then call them foreign invaders and class them as white, is pure evil fantasy, or we can say devil's wild imagination. According to Sayana, the word Dasyu derives from the root das, meaning one who harms. This again bears out the earlier meaning that the Dasyus were supernatural beings who harmed the people by obstructing rain. From historical parallels, we can deduce that reference to color, burner of the complexion often refers to the leadership only and not to the actual people. Thus, when Bharatiya histories refer to white armies, they only mean armies led and commanded by the Europeans, or those which fought in the cause of the Europeans. Actually, the entire army was not white. In fact, a vast majority was not white, and yet it was called a white army. Considering all this, the fancied confrontation of the so-called Aryas with the Dasyus, believed to be natives, is all a case of misunderstanding and misinterpretation due to ignorance or with evil intentions. This much conclusions we can derive. Western scholars have played havoc with the Rig Veda in reading into it a class and color struggle, and in trying to squeeze historical theories out of a theological or often metaphysical work. From all these analyses, we can conclude that the Aryan were no race, but the Bharatiya ideal of a thoroughbred man, a perfect gentleman. Secondly, the traces of Sanskrit culture that we find all over the world do not originate from any Aryan race or language, but from the pioneering effort of Sanskrit-speaking Bharatiyas to carry the torch of knowledge and art and culture to remotest part of the world. Another conclusion we draw from this analysis is that Sanskrit was not only widely spoken in Bharat, but it was widely spoken world language in ancient times, before the appearance of a so-called Jesus or Muhammad. There having been no Aryan race as such, all efforts or conspiracy to find their homeland, traces of their migration and their original language were bound to be fruitless, as indeed they have been. It is a completely useless of time and energy to try to find out what was the homeland of the Aryans. This belief in an Aryan race has been a blunder of historical research. It needs to be rebutted, and all references to the Aryan as a race and their supposed migration ought to be deleted from world or Indian history. Instead, it should be clearly understood that it was the Indians, the Bharatiyas, the Aryans, the thoroughbred men who migrated from their Indo-Gangetic plain, from Punjab, from Kashmir and Gandhar home. That time Gandhar was also a part of Bharat, Greater Bharat, to all other parts of the world. They were going to spread education, knowledge, science, agriculture, etc. The so-called Indo-European languages are all derived from the Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit language of Bharat, namely Sanskrit Bhasha. It is futile to regard Sanskrit as a collateral of languages like Persian and Latin, and then try to find their common ancestor. These attempts all derived from the mistaken notion that there were a people called Aryans who lived somewhere in Europe and from there migrated to Bharat. Since there were no such people, there is no fancied language of theirs. There are no such people, so there was no fancied language of theirs. What then remains as the sole source of the world's ancient mode culture is not Indo-European, but only the Indo-civilization or Vaidic civilization. Vaidic language, Vaidic civilization and Vaidic culture. And one language that was only Sanskrit Bhata. Sanskrit language was spoken all over the world, because India, Bharat, was the capital of the world. So I leave it that, and hope this episode shall enlighten some pure Sanatani souls, and who will think very seriously to protect their civilization. Hare Krishna.